I think we can learn something about the heart of God, who we would like to hang around with, and who and what God is all about. Right, we've so far looked at the broad background of the Israel in which Jesus lived. So now we're going to focus in on the little village of Nazareth and see what it's all about. I say little because this is exactly what Nazareth was. It may surprise us to learn that scholars' estimates of Nazareth have it at somewhere between 200 and 480 people. It was a very small place. In the early 80s, they'd estimated it at just over 1,000, but as happens with archaeology, in recent years they've brought it down a bit. Different scholars say different things, 200, 400, 480, so we can imagine Nazareth as a small place where everybody knows everybody else and there are no secrets. In terms of physical dimensions, Nazareth is 400 meters long by 100 meters wide. Again, a very small place, just a dorpy. A lot of ancient cities might surprise us, actually by their size compared with today. Even London of 500 years ago was very small compared with what we might think compared with the London of today. What Nazareth did have going for it, however, is that it was situated between two very prominent locales. Right. Okay. One to the north and one to the south. The first of these locales was the city Sepphoris. Now, that's an aerial view of Sepphoris. It doesn't look like much from the archaeological digs, but it turned quite a few heads 2,000 years ago. As I said, it was only 6 kilometers away from Nazareth. But too soft. Okay. Where's Ant? Good. Sorry, can you? I'll try to speak up. Sorry, can you call Ant? Okay, I'll try to speak up. Sorry. Okay. That's a view of Nazareth from Sepphoris. That's Nazareth up on the hill. As you can see, 6 kilometers away, it's a fairly easy hour-long walk. Both locales were set on hills with a gentle valley between them. So Joseph and Jesus would have quite easily made the walk across. Sepphoris itself, that region there at the bottom, that's a famous theatre, famous Roman theatre in Sepphoris. That over there was not around 2,000 years ago. That's a Crusader fort built in the 1000s, 1100s by the Crusaders. But nonetheless, that's what they've dug up so far of ancient Sepphoris. Sepphoris had a population of about 12,000 people. Being a royal city, it came with all the trimmings. It had 2 markets, had the Roman theatre I've just shown you now, where one could enjoy many of the amusements of Rome, including plays, comedy, and mime, and a population of about 12,000 people. So it was by comparison, Nazareth was totally dwarfed by Sepphoris. Right, that's one of the main streets running through Sepphoris. Now, interestingly enough, we know from excavations at Antioch, which is in Syria, which is quite a way up north, they've uncovered indications of 2.5 miles of oil lamps set on poles, which obviously precede our modern, or precedents for our modern street lights. And Sepphoris, there's no indication of that. We find the same thing in Sepphoris. But being a royal city, one wouldn't be surprised if it did have something like that. That's the famous Roman theatre. Interestingly enough, you'd see a lot of Romans there, Sepphoris being a very Roman-orientated city, but you wouldn't find many strict Jews at all because the rabbis had a thing, especially about Greek theatre, and they wouldn't be seen dead there. One can imagine standing on the hill on which Nazareth was built and looking out to Sepphoris. One can imagine Joseph, Mary, any of the Nazareth townsfolk looking out, craning their heads with excitement. Nazareth being built up as a city at the time when Jesus was growing up. Perhaps oohs and ahs from the townfolk about the city just over the rise, all these new developments. Perhaps Joseph and Jesus themselves going over and helping with the development. But at the same time, there would have been a fair amount of muttering about Sepphoris, and this for a couple of reasons. First of all, as I said, Sepphoris was a city with a distinctly Roman flavor. Herod the Great knew how to butter up his Roman overlords. He was famous for his vast, very extravagant buildings. He'd built the famous Caesarea Maritima, a famous city on the western coast, on the Mediterranean coast. I think it even had a Roman temple, had a Roman hippodrome, and his son Herod Antipas, obviously, the apple didn't fall too far from the tree, also trying to butter up his Roman overlords, trying to build a city that would be accessible to the Romans living in Israel at the time. In 18 AD, Herod Antipas would change his mind, forget about Sepphoris, the royal city, and he would build up a brand new city from scratch called Tiberias, and that was on the southwest coast of the Sea of Galilee. And he would actually enrage the Jews by building it on a Jewish burial ground, which is one thing you didn't do, and he would name it after the then Roman Emperor Tiberius, who had taken over in AD 14. So the Herods they knew on what side their bread was buttered, and they knew how to butter up the Caesars. All of which would be going through the minds of the Nazarenes and other conservatively minded Jews in Israel, who would be very concerned about all the Roman influence and where it was going, and just the fear and worry that Rome was getting a bit too close. The second reason they might have concerns about Sepphoris is from a taxation point of view. They might have asked themselves, where's the money coming from? And for good reason, because the taxes were being squeezed out of the poor peasant classes who could barely afford it, who could ill afford it. A note about taxes: estimations are that the average Israelite would have had to pay somewhere between 28 and 40% in taxes in the ancient world. Some estimate that for some people taxes would have been more than 50%. So if you're a poor peasant who's hardly got anything to rub together, who hardly got 2 coins to rub together, 28 to 40% is quite a whack if you try to look after your family as well. Sorry. Right, so much for Sepphoris up north, just a short walk up north. If you then turned and faced southwards from Nazareth, you would see, sorry, I'm going backwards. You would see the Via Maris. Now, what is the Via Maris? Via Maris literally means the road of the sea, or the way of the sea. We know about the famous Roman roads. There were approximately 400,000 kilometers of Roman roads trailing all through the empire, and the Via Maris, which is this red line going up the coast there, that is one of the more famous roads in that part of the Roman world. That's the King's Highway, that red line there, very famous, especially in the Old Testament. Your Abraham, your Moses would have known all about that. That doesn't really come into our story. We're looking at the Via Maris. Now, the Via Maris started in Egypt down south, and then it trailed up to about halfway up Israel, then at which stage it shoots inland and goes up in a northeasterly direction all the way up to Antioch in Syria. But the interesting thing is, in so doing, it passes directly, probably about there, it passes directly underneath Nazareth. So we've got these two important locales between this comparatively minor village. We've got this important, bustling Roman city a few miles to the north, and we've got this very important trade route running to the south. So Nazareth, although it's a dorpy, it's not totally out of the way. It's not a backwater. It's actually between two fairly prominent locations, and one gets the impression that Joseph and Jesus would have made use, especially of the Via Maris, to do business with the traders and people coming past. Right, so far we've had a look at just what lies just outside Nazareth. Now we're going to have a look at the village itself. And if we were to go back in time to the little village of between 200 and 480 people, the first thing we would see is a series of relatively small white houses with flat roofs. But that's also the Via Maris there. That picture is in the southwest part of Israel, that's the Via Maris going through there. Those stones, don't worry about those. That's in Philistine territory. I understand those are the remains of Philistine high places, so don't worry too much about that. But nonetheless, that's the Via Maris going through there as it exists today. Right, on to Nazareth. Now, you'd also see that there, that's Mary's well. Archaeologists have uncovered approximately what could be as many as 7 wells in Nazareth itself, but the only 2 that they have identified positively as wells. That's one of them there, Mary's well. A very common sight in Nazareth would be the women going to fetch water at the wells. They would have had their vases, their container jugs at their hips, taken a bucket, put the bucket down, brought up the water, filled up the jars, and went home. It's a very common thing. Mary would have done it often. She would have sent her daughters to do it often. So the wells are a prominent feature of ancient life. The houses would have not had too many windows. The few windows they would have had would have been small and quite high up on the wall, the reason being to safeguard against burglaries. The roads would be quite narrow and quite rickety. Now, just to imagine what somebody in that day and age might have looked like, all right. Now, that is a coin that was minted in the 1st century, and the face that you can see or can hardly see on it is that of none other than Herod Philip, who, as I said, ruled that region to the east of Galilee after his father, the murderous Herod the Great, had died. Now, you can't see that very well, but that is an attempt. They've tried to get computers to bring all the existing coin images of Herod Philip together, and that's what they've come up with. Not great, it's a bit blurry, but it's very important because it's possibly the only image we have of a New Testament or Gospel-era person, a Gospel-era character, mainly because the Jews were very nervous about putting the images on anything. You don't find too many statues in Israel. They usually didn't like putting the images on coins. But this is possibly the only example we have of somebody, of a Jewish-orientated person in the Gospel period. So if we just look at that very broadly, that might give us the idea of what somebody in the Middle East might have looked like at that point. As we walk through the streets of ancient Nazareth, the first thing that would have struck us as unusual is the average size of the person in the street. The height of the average man would have been 5 foot 6 inches. The height of the average woman would have been 4 foot 9 inches. So that'd be a slight culture shock, the first culture shock. The other thing that might surprise us is the average age of the average person in the street. Not surprisingly, given the conditions in which they lived, given the medical conditions, life expectancy was on the whole very low. The average lifespan was somewhere between 30 and 45 years. Some estimated as low as 25 years. A couple of statistics here that help bring that out. Only 1 in 5, 20% of the population had a hope of reaching the age of 50. 3% would have reached the age of 60. Only 1 in 3 children would have reached the age of 18. So we must understand these people, they're hard people, they live in hard times, and I think there'd be a bit of culture shock there if we went back in time. I think we'd come across extremely, very hardened people, but very tough people, certainly compared with the rather privileged lifestyles that we lead in the modern West. Right, now if we were to walk into one of the houses, oh wait a minute.